She traded her last good horse for 60 molting hens that hadn't laid an egg in 3 weeks, and every man in Sutter's Crossing told her she'd lost her mind along with everything else. They weren't wrong about the hens. 60 birds, feathers coming in patchy, combs pale, bought off a bankrupt egg farmer named Co., who was selling everything that could walk or be carried before the bank came for the rest. Elsa Vane stood in that dirt lot off the Territorial Road on a gray Tuesday in late October and looked at those birds the way other people in Sutter's Crossing had been looking at her lately, like something to be assessed for remaining value before writing it off entirely. She was 29 years old. Her husband Roy had been dead 11 months. The Vane place, 40 acres of creek bottom and rocky benchland in the Morrow River drainage, was mortgaged against a note at Sutter's Crossing Savings that came due in March. $380 she did not have. What she had was the land itself, a milk cow named Duchess, a mule, a kitchen garden put up in jars, and now 60 molting hens that the previous owner had already given up on. She paid $31 for them. It was most of what she had left in the blue tin on the kitchen shelf. She walked those hens back herself, 3 miles up the creek road, using a pair of cedar branches to keep them moving in something resembling the right direction. It took most of the afternoon. When the last bird was penned and she'd latched the gate, she stood at the fence and looked at them in the fading light and let herself think the thought she'd been holding off all day, that she might have made a serious mistake. The thought lasted until she went inside and built the fire. Then she got out the letter. She'd found it in October of the year before, going through her husband's papers in the 2 weeks after the funeral, when she still couldn't sleep past 3 in the morning. A single folded page from a mail-order poultry catalog, probably 6 years old, the edges soft with handling. Roy had tucked it into the back of his farm ledger without comment, but he'd marked 3 lines with pencil. She'd read those 3 lines so many times she no longer needed the paper. Heritage breed laying hens, naturally maintained on forage and whole grain, produced eggs of notably superior flavor and color, preferred by hotel kitchens and restaurant buyers seeking differentiated product. Price per dozen, premium above standard market rate. She'd thought about those 3 lines through the whole of November and most of December. Roy had read them and thought something. She didn't know exactly what he'd thought, but she knew the kind of man he was, careful and quiet and thorough, and she thought he'd probably seen the same thing she was seeing now. That the Vane place had something most of the valley didn't. The south-facing slope above the creek, wild with clover and native grasses, and the remnants of an old apple planting her husband's father had started and abandoned, and the old stone hen house, built into the hillside 40 years back by Roy's grandfather, solid as anything in the county, with the laying boxes his wife had fitted, and the cedar board flooring Roy had replaced 2 summers ago. It had been sitting empty since the last flock died in the summer heat. Elsa had maintained it, swept the floor, checked the latch, kept the waterers clear. She wasn't sure why, except that Roy had taken care of it, and she'd kept on taking care of it, because stopping felt like losing something she hadn't lost yet. She'd been waiting, without entirely knowing it, to put something back inside those walls. The first problem was what she already knew going in. 60 molting hens were not 60 laying hens. Molt was natural. The birds were cycling out old feathers and redirecting protein and energy toward regrowth. But the conventional approach, the one every egg farmer in the valley used, was to force hens through the cycle fast on high-protein feed and push them back into production as quickly as possible. Feed costs money. Empty nest boxes cost money. Speed was the logic. Elsa didn't intend to use that logic. She'd done her reading through the winter, careful reading, from whatever she could find. Her husband's almanacs, a pamphlet from the Agricultural Extension Office in Dunmore that she'd had to write away for, waiting 3 weeks for it to come in on the freight wagon. 2 issues of a poultry journal Roy had kept in the barn loft, reading them the way you read things that might matter, slowly, twice. What she'd taken from all of it wasn't a formula, it was a direction. Birds that ranged on natural forage, grasses, insects, clover, windfall fruit, produced eggs different from birds that ate nothing but commercial mash in an enclosed yard. The yolk color was deeper, the flavor was richer. People who'd eaten both described the difference clearly, even if they couldn't explain it. The extension pamphlet cited a hotel chef in Denver who could identify range-fed eggs blind in a tasting and would not buy anything else for his kitchen. She thought about the south slope. She thought about all that clover, The first 2 weeks, she didn't rush them. She let the hens settle into the stone house, let them find the laying boxes at their own pace, let them begin to understand the routine of the yard. She opened the slope gate on the 10th day and waited to see what they'd do. They went up the slope like they'd been waiting for permission. By the end of the second week, she had 11 eggs. The following week, 19. Not much, but the birds were still in various stages of molt. She could see it resolving in their feathers, the new plumage coming in dense and glossy, in a way the old feathers hadn't been. She noted it in the ledger she kept on the kitchen shelf, next to the blue tin. The problem she hadn't fully solved was money. She had enough in the tin to carry herself and Duchess, and the hens through December, if she was careful. She'd sold the 3 remaining beef calves in November and put that against the household account, but it didn't reach far. The note came due in March. She had $380 to find from a standing start in the middle of a Wyoming winter. She'd gone over it the way you go over something when you've already gone over it too many times. The numbers worn smooth from handling. There was no path from here to $380 by March, using any method she'd seen anyone in the valley use. She'd have had to start a year ago with twice the capital, and she'd started with almost none. What she had was a stone hen house, and a south slope and 60 birds that were slowly beginning to look like what she needed them to become. The first person to say something to her face about the hens was Dwight Calder, who ran the dry goods counter at Fenwick's Mercantile and functioned, in the social ecosystem of Sutter's Crossing, as the main distribution point for local news and opinion. He was behind the counter when she came in for lamp oil in the 3rd week of November, and he said it while she was counting out her coins. Something about old Coe's birds, something about how Coe himself hadn't been able to do anything with them. He wasn't unkind about it. He said it the way people in small towns say things that have been said already elsewhere, confirming the consensus. "They're coming along," Elsa said. She paid for the lamp oil and left. Walking home up the creek road, she heard the thing she always heard in those moments. Not his voice exactly, but the accumulated tone of all the conversations that had happened without her since Roy died. The widow Vane, good woman, terrible luck, that hillside place. Always wondered why Roy stuck with it. She was used to hearing those conversations secondhand. She'd been the subject of them since November of the previous year, and she'd learned to treat them the way her father had taught her to treat bad weather. You noted it, you prepared for it, you moved through it. What she was thinking about now was the slope. By December, the hens had settled into a pattern that she hadn't entirely planned for, but recognized as useful. They went up the slope each morning on their own, through the gate she left open at first light. They worked the clover and the dried grass stems and the leaf mold under the old apple trees, scratching with the methodical efficiency of animals doing what their biology had designed them to do. They came back down in the late afternoon, and she closed the gate and checked the laying boxes. The eggs were changing. She noticed it first in the yolk color, a deeper yellow, going toward orange in the freshest ones, the color you saw in eggs from the old country pictures in Roy's grandmother's almanac, but rarely in the eggs sold at the Sutter's Crossing market. She cracked one into a pan on a Sunday morning and looked at it for a long time before she cooked it. Then she ate it standing at the stove and stood there afterward for a moment, thinking. She wrote in her ledger, December 12. Yolk color good, flavor different, richer. Find out who to talk to. The who turned out to be a woman named Bertie Oakes, who drove a supply route from Sutter's Crossing northwest to the Sentinel Valley hotels and had been doing it for 11 years. Elsa knew her by sight. A compact woman, maybe 50, with the tan of someone who spent most of her life outdoors and the directness of someone who'd wasted enough time on indirection to have stopped. Bertie bought eggs from 3 farms on her route. She'd been buying from the same sources for 7 years. Elsa waited until she saw Bertie's wagon at the Fenwick's loading dock on a Thursday morning in late December, and she walked up and introduced herself and said what she needed to say without preamble, because Bertie Oakes did not look like a woman who had patience for preamble. I've got range-fed eggs from heritage birds on a creek-bottom property south of town. Yolks deep orange. Flavors different from what you're carrying. I'd like you to try one before you say no. Bertie looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who'd heard claims about eggs before. How many birds? 60. Coming up toward full production. What are you getting per dozen now? 42 on average. Going up. Bertie was quiet a second, Market rate's 22 cents. I'm not asking market rate. That stopped her. What are you asking? Try the eggs first. Then we talk price. Bertie took 2 eggs from the sample Elsa had brought. She had a small skillet on the iron brazier. She kept in the back of her wagon for exactly this kind of transaction. She'd told Elsa later, because she'd learned that words about food meant nothing, and the food itself meant everything. She cracked both eggs, looked at the yolks without comment, cooked them plain. She ate them standing at the back of the wagon with the December wind coming in off the ridge. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Where do you get that color?" she said finally. "South slope above the creek. Clover's thick up there. Old apple trees." Bertie looked at her. "Say Birds Co. was trying to move in October?" "Same birds." Something shifted in Bertie's expression. Not quite respect, something more careful than that. The reassessment of a practical woman encountering something she hadn't expected. Co. couldn't get those birds laying worth a damn. Co. was running them in a closed yard on commercial mash. "That's not what I'm doing." Bertie was quiet again. "The Beaumont in Sentinel Valley has been asking me for 8 months whether I can find a consistent source of something better than what I'm carrying. Their kitchen manager's name is Alderman. He's particular. I've brought him 3 different farm samples in the past year, and he's rejected all of them." Elsa waited. "If you can hold 40 dozen a week by February," Bertie said, "I'll take them to Alderman. What he does with it is between him and you." Elsa thought about her 42 birds currently in production, the 18 still coming through the last of their molt, the slope and the clover and the cold weeks ahead. 40 dozen a week was 480 eggs. Her current 42 birds were averaging just over 3 eggs per bird per week in December conditions, trending upward. By February, if the weather held and the molt finished clean, 60 birds at peak range-fed production could realistically reach that number. Could. Realistically. If. "I can hold it," she said. Bertie looked at her for a moment longer. "Come back to me in January with a sample from the full flock. If it holds consistent, I'll make the introduction." She drove away, and Elsa stood at the loading dock in the cold for a moment before she walked home. January came in hard, the way Wyoming January always came, without apology. The temperature dropped, the creek froze to the crossing, and the road out of the valley was closed for 10 days after a storm that came down off the high country and sat there. Elsa used the closure. The hens still went up the slope on the days warm enough to open the gate. She was not going to interrupt that pattern, not even in January. But on the storm days, she supplemented with whole oats and dried apple. She'd sliced and strung in the henhouse through October, hanging in pale loops from the ceiling beams, like small decorations that were entirely practical. She'd read about dried fruit supplementation in one of Roy's poultry journals, and had spent a long afternoon in October slicing and stringing 3 bushels of windfall apples from the slope trees while the hens picked around her feet, and the light went gold on the benchland. She hadn't been certain it would matter. She was more certain now. The production numbers through January held better than she'd expected from birds in cold weather conditions, and the yolk color, which she checked every morning with the same attention she gave the thermometer, stayed deep. She kept notes on everything. Wood stove temperature in the henhouse during overnight cold, feed amounts, water, thaw times. Individual she'd started to recognize by their laying patterns, the big Rhode Island red, who laid every morning before the others, the pale Dominique, who skipped every 4th day like clockwork. She'd never kept records at this level before. It felt necessary now in a way it hadn't, when this was just a way to make a little money from eggs. It was something else now. She wasn't entirely sure what, but she could feel the shape of it forming. In the 2nd week of January, a man named Franklin Birch came up the creek road on horseback. He ran a modest cattle operation east of town and had been friendly with Roy, the kind of friendship that existed between neighbors who helped each other during branding and harvest, and did not otherwise socialize much. He came nominally to return a fence stretcher Roy had lent him 2 years back. He stood in the yard while Elsa got a cup of coffee going on the stove, and he looked at the henhouse and then up at the south slope where a dozen birds were working the frozen grass, despite the cold. "Heard you bought Coe's birds," he said when she handed him the coffee. "In October, Coe's birds." He said it the way Dwight Calder had, the same inflection, as if confirming that yes, these were indeed the birds in question, the ones in the story everyone already knew. "They're not the same birds they were in October," Elsa said. Birch looked at her. What do you mean? Come look. She took him to the laying boxes, pulled 2 eggs, set them on the wooden ledge where the light came through the high window. The yolks, she'd cracked them into a small dish for exactly this kind of moment, were the color of marigolds. He looked at them, looked at her, looked back at the eggs. I didn't know eggs looked like that, he said. Most of them don't. He was quiet a moment. He drank the coffee. My wife's been saying for 2 years that the eggs from the Fenwick's market taste like nothing. She grew up in Pennsylvania farm country. Says eggs there tasted like something. These taste like something, Elsa said. He looked at her steadily. He was a man who processed things at his own pace and resented being hurried. What are you doing with them? Talking to a buyer in Sentinel Valley. If that goes where I think it's going, I'll need a more reliable setup than I have now. What kind of setup? She told him. She needed someone to cover the slope gate and the morning feed. On the 3 days a week, she went to Dunmore to sell at the market, which she'd been doing since December to build working capital. She needed another set of eyes on the flock because she'd been running alone since October, and she was beginning to understand what that cost. Birch was quiet for a longer moment. My daughter's looking for work. She's 16, knows animals, grew up on this place before she moved with her mother and came back to me last spring. He paused. She's not a girl who needs things explained twice. Send her tomorrow morning, Elsa said. I'll show her the routine. Her name was Susanna Birch, and she arrived the next morning in tall boots and a heavy coat with a notebook under her arm, which told Elsa something before she'd said a word. Susanna was 16 and had the quality of stillness that some people develop young from spending a lot of time observing rather than talking. She watched Elsa run through the morning routine, opening the slope gate, checking the laying boxes, measuring the feed supplementation, noting the count, and she asked 4 questions, all of them practical, and she took notes in the notebook with a focused economy that made Elsa revise her first estimate of the girl upward. On the 3rd morning, Susanna said, "The gray birds are doing something different with the slope." Elsa looked. The Dominique hens, the pale gray ones, had moved their morning foraging pattern up past the old apple tree line to a section of benchland where the native grass had stayed uncovered under a windbreak. The other birds were still working the lower slope. They found something, Susanna said. She walked up there, bent down, looked. Wild onion. The frost brought it up through the snow. Elsa hadn't known wild onion grew on that bench. She hadn't walked that part of the property since fall. Does that affect the eggs? Susanna looked at her with the expression of someone who was deciding whether to say something she wasn't sure of. My grandmother, back in Ohio, kept hens that ran a pasture with wild onion. She said it made the eggs taste stronger. I don't know if that's good or bad for what you're doing. Let's find out, Elsa said. She collected the next day's eggs from those birds separately, noted which were which in the ledger, cracked 2 of each the next morning side by side. The wild onion bird's eggs had something additional in the yolk, a depth, a faint earthiness underneath the richness. She stood at the stove with both dishes in front of her and thought for a long time. She wrote in her notebook, January 29, "Bench birds different. Find out if this is repeatable." Bertie Oakes came back in the first week of February. She came up the creek road herself this time, in the wagon, which meant she was treating it as something more than a casual inquiry. Elsa was in the hen house when she heard the wheels on the gravel, and she came out and they stood in the yard in the February cold, and Bertie looked at the slope where the flock was spread across the benchland in the pale morning light. "Same birds," Bertie said, and this time it wasn't a question. Same birds. Bertie came inside. Elsa had eggs from 4 different foraging areas of the slope, marked and separated in the same way she'd been separating them since Susanna noticed the bench birds. She showed Bertie the notebook. The daily production counts, the yolk color notations, the foraging location records. Bertie went through it the way Elsa had noticed practical people always went through things. Quickly, but not carelessly. What's this notation here? Bench birds, wild onion, depth in yolk different. There's a section of benchland above the apple trees where wild onion grows. The birds that forage up there produce a slightly different egg. More complex flavor. Bertie looked at her over the notebook. You've been separating them? Since I found out. How many of those per week? Right now, 12 to 14 dozen, depending on which birds rotate up there. Bertie set the notebook down. Alderman at the Beaumont is going to want to try those separately from the standard range stock. Some restaurants charge a menu premium for sourced specialty ingredients. This, she tapped the notebook, is a sourced specialty ingredient. Elsa had not thought about it in exactly those terms. She'd been thinking about eggs. She was beginning to understand that what she'd been building was something with a different name. "What do you need from me before you take it to him?" she said. 2 weeks of consistent numbers at what you showed me in December. 40 dozen standard range, 12 to 14 dozen bench birds. Separate, labeled consistent. She paused. "Can you hold that?" "I can hold it." Bertie nodded. "I'll take a sample to Alderman on the 20th. Send word through Fenwick's." She left, and the February morning was quiet behind her. Susanna was on the slope, visible at the top of the bench with her notebook open, doing the morning count. Elsa watched her for a moment, then went back to the henhouse. The word came through Fenwick's on a Wednesday, carried by Dwight Calder himself, who came up the creek road with it tucked in his vest pocket. He handed it over at the gate with an expression she couldn't quite read, part curious, part something she'd have called impressed if Dwight Calder were a man given to being impressed. He walked back down the road without much comment, and Elsa opened the note standing at the fence post. Bertie's handwriting was the same as her conversation, direct, without decoration. Alderman at the Beaumont tasted the range stock first. He held the bench eggs back. When he tried those, he asked me where they came from and how many I could get him. I told him I'd have an answer by Friday. He wants a regular weekly allocation. Range stock and bench birds separate, starting in March. He's talking to the kitchen manager at the Meridian Hotel in Dunmore and the dining room at the Drover's Rest in Sentinel. These are his words, not mine. "This is the best egg I've tasted in 20 years of running a hotel kitchen. Send me a number by Friday." Elsa read it twice. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She went to find Franklin Birch. He was in his barn, mending a section of corral fence, and he listened to her explain it the same way he listened to everything, at his own pace, without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How many birds do you need?" "I have 60. To hold Alderman's allocation and add Dunmore and the Drover's Rest, I need to expand the flock by at least a third. Same profile. Heritage breeds, older birds if I can get them, birds that'll take to range feeding. Where are you going to get them?" "That's what I came to ask you. You move stock through the valley. Who's sitting on laying flocks they're not using well?" He thought about it. He had the kind of memory for local agricultural inventory that people who'd been farming a place for 20 years developed without trying. There's a widow named Goss over on the Decker Road who lost her husband last spring and has been trying to keep a flock of about 40 birds going on her own. The birds are decent heritage stock. Her husband sourced them from back east, but she can't manage the range program by herself, and the eggs have suffered for it. Would she sell? I think she'd consider it. She's been talking to the Hobbs family about taking on a partner arrangement, but Hobbs is more interested in the land than the birds. I'll go see her. Birch nodded. He looked at his corral fence, then at her. My daughter's been coming home talking about your hen house and your slope and your ledger every evening for 3 weeks, he said. She's been keeping notes on your birds the way I've seen grown men keep notes on cattle operations. He paused. I thought you should know that. Elsa thought about Susanna on the bench that morning, bent over her notebook in the February cold. She's the reason I know about the wild onion, she said. He looked at her steadily. That particular look she'd been seeing more of lately from the men in the valley, not condescension, but a careful recalibration, the expression of someone adjusting an estimate. All right, he said, and went back to his fence. The widow Goss was named Pauline, and she answered her door in a barn coat with egg on the sleeve, which Elsa took as a good sign. She was maybe 60, with the direct manner of a woman who'd been running a farm household her whole life and had no patience left for indirection. They sat at Pauline's kitchen table, and Elsa laid it out plainly. What she was doing, what she needed, what she was offering. She wasn't looking to buy Pauline's land or absorb her operation. She wanted the birds and a first refusal arrangement on eggs from Pauline's own laying stock if Pauline wanted to keep some back. Pauline listened without expression. When Elsa finished, she said, Your husband was Roy Vane. He was good man, quiet. She folded her hands on the table. My husband bought 24 chicks from a breeder in Pennsylvania 4 years ago. He was particular about breed, said the heritage birds were worth twice the trouble they gave you. He was right. Pauline was quiet a moment. 32 birds. I'll ask $4 per bird. That's Pennsylvania-sourced heritage stock, and I won't apologize for the price. Elsa did the math. It was more per bird than she'd have paid at auction. It was also birds she could trust, sourced well, no guessing at their history. I'll take them, she said. They shook hands across the kitchen table, and Pauline's grip was the kind that didn't leave room for renegotiation. Elsa respected that. Getting 32 hens down the Decker Road and up the Creek Road to the Vane place took most of a Thursday, with Birch's wagon and Susanna's help, and a considerable expenditure of patience. The new birds went into the lower yard for the first week. She wasn't going to put unfamiliar stock directly onto the slope, and she watched how they integrated and noted it in the ledger. Susanna cataloged each bird within 2 hours of arrival. She'd developed her own notation system by this point, a series of small marks in her notebook that tracked individual birds by their distinguishing physical features, because Elsa hadn't gotten around to banding them yet. It was a more detailed system than Elsa's own, and it embarrassed her slightly to realize this, and she said so. I just started later than you, Susanna said, which was not entirely an explanation, but was clearly meant as one. By early March, the flock was 91 birds, and the slope looked, in the mornings, like something from a painting Elsa had once seen in a church social hall in Dunmore, a broad hillside lit with early light, covered with moving birds working through the clover and grass, with the purposeful energy of creatures engaged in exactly what they were built for. The numbers held. 43 dozen range eggs that week, 13.5 dozen bench eggs. She sent word to Bertie, who sent word to Alderman, who sent his first payment in advance on delivery, which Elsa received on a Wednesday morning via the Sentinel Valley Freight Service in a sealed envelope that Bertie's driver handed over at the gate without ceremony. She went inside, set the envelope on the kitchen shelf next to the blue tin, and didn't open it until she'd finished the morning feed and gotten the flock settled. The amount matched what she and Bertie had calculated. She put most of it in the tin. She set aside what she needed for the next 2 weeks of feed. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything in particular. Outside, she could hear Susanna moving the flock up the slope for the morning. She could hear Duchess making her feelings known from the barn about the timing of her grain. The stove needed feeding. She fed the stove and went back to work. March moved fast. Having Alderman's weekly allocation on a schedule changed the texture of the daily work in a way she hadn't anticipated, not making it heavier, but making it more purposeful in the way that a target date makes everything between feel like it's pointed at something. She expanded the wild onion bench foraging rotation after Susanna mapped the full extent of the growth up there, a broader patch than either of them had realized, sufficient to support a larger number of birds on a rotation that would keep the forage from being stripped. She noted the rotation schedule in the ledger and gave Susanna a copy. Susanna had started keeping her own duplicate ledger for the flock at some point in February, which Elsa had not assigned and had not noticed until she saw Susanna cross-referencing it with her own notation one morning. "Why 2 ledgers?" Elsa asked. "In case something happens to one of them," Susanna said. Elsa didn't say anything to that. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was checking the records for the last week of egg weights, and she carried the fact of a 16-year-old girl who kept a backup ledger without being asked for the rest of the morning. In the 3rd week of March, Dwight Calder came up the Creek Road again. This time he did not have a delivery. He came on foot, which meant he was coming to talk. She was splitting wood when he came through the gate, and she kept splitting until he was close enough that stopping felt natural. He looked at the slope, where the flock was spread across the upper bench in the early morning light, and he stood there long enough for her to see him recalibrating something. "I've been hearing things," he said. "I imagine you have." Alderman at the Beaumont sent word to his brother-in-law, who works at the Territorial Bank in Dunmore. His brother-in-law mentioned it to Mrs. Calder at the Dry Goods Association meeting. He paused. "You're supplying 3 hotel kitchens, 2 hotels and a dining room," Elsa said, starting in April. He was quiet. He had the expression of a man who had said something at a counter in October that he was now considering in a different light. "The Voss family over in Banner Creek is selling off a laying flock this spring, 60 birds, heritage stock, the husband's retiring from farming. I thought you might want to know before they put it to auction." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" He adjusted his hat brim. Because Calla Hobbs over at the Sutter's Bank told me last week that there's been talk about whether your note can be extended if you need more time. He paused. I thought you might not need it. Thought you might want the Voss birds instead. She held that for a moment. Dwight Calder had not gone to bat for her in October when she'd been standing at a counter with 60 birds nobody wanted. He was going to bat for her now. Give me the Voss family's information, she said. He wrote it on a piece of store paper and left it with her and went back down the road. The Voss flock was solid, 63 birds, heritage barred Plymouth Rock, well kept and range accustomed, from an old farm family who'd done things correctly for 40 years and were finishing with the same standard they'd started. The price was higher than auction would have been. She paid it without argument because the condition of the birds was worth the premium and because she knew, in the way she now knew a number of things she hadn't known in October, that the right animals at the right price mattered more than the cheapest animals at any price. The note came due on the 1st of April. On the last Friday of March, Elsa walked into the Sutter's Crossing Savings Building and set $380 on the desk of a man named Crawford, who handled the agricultural accounts. He looked at the money. He counted it. He wrote the receipt in that methodical way of bank clerks who know the weight of what they're writing. Account settled, he said. I know, she said. She took the receipt and put it in her coat pocket next to her notebook and walked out into the March morning. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would feel when she'd thought about it in November, lying awake at 3 in the morning with the weight of the number in her chest. It felt like the end of a calculation she'd been running for 5 months, and the beginning of several other calculations she hadn't yet finished. She went home and checked the laying boxes. The thing she hadn't told Bertie, hadn't told Alderman, hadn't told anyone, was that she'd spent the past 6 weeks quietly writing down everything she knew about the operation. Not the daily ledger. That was working notes, functional. What she'd been writing was something more complete. The slope management, the foraging rotation, the supplementation schedule through winter, the wild onion bench, and what she now understood about how forage variety affected yolk composition. The hen house temperature management, the integration protocol for new birds. The things that lived in her hands and her daily observations that she'd never put into language precise enough for someone else to follow. She'd been resistant to doing it, in the way you're resistant to the task that seems to undermine the thing that makes you particular. If it was written down, it could be done by someone else. She'd sat with that resistance for a few weeks before she understood it for what it was. Not a protection of her process, but a protection of her ego. The process wasn't hers. The process was what the hillside and the birds, and 5 months of careful attention had taught her. Writing it down was just honoring it correctly. The document took her 2 weeks, written in the evenings at the kitchen table after supper, with a lamp and the ledger for reference. When she finished it, she gave a copy to Franklin Birch. "What's this for?" he said. "If something happens to me, Susanna needs to be able to run the flock without starting from zero." He looked at her over the pages. "You're thinking about that. I'm thinking about everything now," she said. "It's a habit I've developed." He folded the document and put it in his coat. He looked out at the slope, where his daughter was moving the bench birds back down through the clover in the late afternoon light. He was quiet for a moment. "She wants to stay on here through the summer," he said finally. "I told her she had to ask you." "She already asked me," Elsa said. 2 weeks ago." He looked at her with an expression between surprise and something closer to satisfaction, the look of a man who has understood something about his daughter that he hadn't known how to see directly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." He nodded slowly. He looked back at the slope. After a moment, he said, "In October, when I heard you'd bought Coe's birds, I figured you were running on grief and not thinking straight." He said it plainly, without excessive apology, the way decent people acknowledge things they got wrong. "I told Emily, my wife, that the Vane place would go by spring." Elsa looked at the slope. The bench birds were coming down through the old apple trees, moving in that deliberate, unhurried way of well-fed hens at the end of a good morning. "It nearly did," she said. "But it didn't," he said. "No," she said. "It didn't." He went home down the creek road, and she stood at the fence until the last of the flock was settled, and then she went inside and rebuilt the fire and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open to a clean page. The summer orders from the hotels in Sentinel Valley and Dunamore had scaled beyond what she'd committed to in February. Alderman had referred 2 other buyers through Bertie's network, and the bench eggs, which had acquired, through some combination of Alderman's enthusiasm and Bertie's talent for description, the informal name Slope Wild in the Beaumont's kitchen, were being requested in quantities that exceeded her current rotation capacity. She needed to expand the bench foraging area, or expand the flock, or both, and she needed to do it without compromising the production quality that had made people request them in the first place. She wrote the problem at the top of the clean page. Then she started writing down what she knew about the south-facing bench land she hadn't yet explored, the section above the apple tree line that she'd never opened to the flock, the one she'd been eyeing since January. She'd need to fence it, which meant labor and material. She'd need to understand the soil and forage composition up there before she turned birds loose on it, which meant walking it herself and having someone with actual knowledge of native plants walk it with her. She wrote, "Ask Susanna about plants on upper bench." She thought about Roy reading those 3 marked lines in the poultry catalog and folding the paper carefully into the back of his ledger. She didn't know what he'd been planning when he marked those lines. She'd never know exactly what he saw when he thought about this hillside and what it could hold, but she knew the kind of man he was, slow, careful, unwilling to do things carelessly, and she thought that whatever he'd imagined, it had something to do with understanding what a piece of ground was actually for, and then having the patience to find out. She'd found out. Not all of it. The upper bench was still waiting, and there were seasons ahead she couldn't plan for yet. But the stone hen house her husband's grandfather had built into the hillside was full of birds again, and the slope above the creek was alive every morning with the movement of animals doing exactly what the ground had been waiting to grow. She closed the notebook. The fire had settled into the quiet, even burn of a well-fed stove. Outside, the last light was going off the ridge in long gold bands, and somewhere on the slope she could hear the settled sounds of the flock at rest. She sat with it for a while. Then she put on her coat and went out to check on Duchess, and latched the henhouse gate against the dark, and came back inside to plan for the morning.